Chapter 11. We had finished the work mapped out for the combined expedition and were prepared for an early morning start for our base, where the company would separate and all except a party of 11 would return to their respective homes. Four of the party, myself included, had decided to accept the invitation of our friends to return to the village of the Temple of the Tao Cross, our former winter quarters. As we stood watching the sunset on the eve of the departure, one of the party said that he had begun to wonder how old civilization and religion really were, and whether the two had really come hand in hand down the long ages of time. Jess replied, "That depends upon what you mean by religion. If by the use of the word religion you mean creed, dogma, or sect, or perhaps superstition, it is very young and does not antedate 20,000 years. But if by the word you mean the reference for the true philosophy of life, a true reference for life itself, thus a true reference for the sublime purity of God, of the great creative cause, then you may trace this back beyond all history, all mythology, all allegory, to the time of man's first event upon earth. Before kings, emperors, or man-made rule held sway in the heart of the first man, there burned or shone forth the greatest reference for the source of all life and the beauty of that life. The beauty and reference of that pure soul shines undimmed through the long ages, and so it will shine on undimmed through all eternity. When man first took up life, he knew full well the source. He had the deepest reference for that source, and that reference you now know as the Christ. But as we come on down the dim corridors of time, we find them divided into the innumerable sects, creeds, and dogmas, until those corridors are divided into such a network that they present a veil of disbelief and superstition. Who, I ask, divided them? Did God or man? Who is responsible for the great vortex of sin and inharmony of division has caused? Will you pause for a moment and think deeply, then ask yourselves, is it God or man that is responsible? Then think, does God sit somewhere in the sky looking down on the great web, altering a condition here or a condition there, interfering here or smoothing out a life there, praising one or condemning another, holding up the hands of one while he tramples the other? No, if there be a true giver of life, he must be omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, far above, around, and in all, pouring out his life to all, through all, and all above. Else he is not a true giver of all life. Thus you may differentiate this idea into innumerable varieties of form, but when you reach the final one, you will find that you reach the one at the beginning also, and the two become a cycle with no beginning and no end. Were this not so, there could be no basis, no hypothesis, no truth. Here someone asked, "Do you attempt to overcome death?" The answer was, "Oh no, we rise up over the death by letting life express to its absolute fullness." Thus, we do not know even what death is. To us, there is nothing but more abundant life. The great error of the majority is that they attempt to hide their religion behind some veil of secret instead of throwing it open to the broad expanse of God's pure sunlight. Someone of the party asked whether Jesus abode with them, meaning just people. He replied, "No, Jesus does not live with us. He is only drawn to us by the thoughts we have in common, the same as he is drawn to all by the thoughts they have in common. Jesus abides only to be of service, as all great souls do." He went on to say, "It was a while sojourning in northern Arabia, that Jesus had access to the library that had been collected from India, Persia, and the Trans-Himalayan region. Here, Jesus first contacted the secret teachings of the Brotherhood. These teachings only served to drive home more firmly the conviction already forming that the true mystery of life was God expressed through the Christ in the individual. He saw that, in order to express this fully, he must withdraw from all forms of worships and worship God expressing through the individual and God alone. He saw that, in order to demonstrate this fully, he would be obliged to withdraw from those who had taught him, even though by withdrawing he should incur their displeasure. This did not deter him for a moment, so steadfast was he in the devotion to his cause, and the great service he saw he could render to the world by that devotion. He saw that if man ever arose to the lofty power of that mighty indwelling presence, if a mighty Son of God, one in whom the divine wisdom abode in fullest measure, one rich in the outpouring richness of all God's treasures, the fountain of the outpouring waters of life, the Lord, or law of compassion and wisdom, was actually to take flesh upon earth, he must come forth and claim those possessions. Then with pure motive he must live the life, and he would bring forth that life, so to which manifest presence the name of the Christ has been given. He stood forth and boldly proclaimed that the Christ that abode in him abode in all, that the celestial voice that proclaimed him the beloved Son proclaimed all sons of God, joint heirs and brothers all. This epoch is marked at his baptism, when the Spirit was seen descending from heaven like a dove upon him, and it abode with him. He also said, all are God's manifest in the flesh. He boldly taught that ignorance is the cause of all sin. He saw that, in order to practice forgiveness, or the signs of forgiving, man must be enlightened to the fact that man has the power to forgive all sin, discord, and inharmony. That is not God who forgives sin, for God has nothing to do with the sin, sickness, and inharmony of man. That man himself brought these into being, and man is the only one who can erase and forgive them. He saw that man must learn that ignorance is disregard and lack of understanding both of divine mind as the creative principle and of his relation to that principle. He saw that man may have all intellectual knowledge and be versed in worldly affairs, yet he does not recognize the Christ as the living, vitalizing essence of God within him. He is grossly ignorant of the most important factor governing his life. He quickly saw the inconsistency of asking a perfectly just and loving Father to heal a disease or sin. He taught that disease is the effect of sin, and that forgiveness is an important factor in healing. That sickness is not punishment sent from God, as many believe it to be, but is the result of man's misunderstanding of his real being. He taught that it is the truth which sets free. The purity of his teachings has caused them to outlive those with his teachers. When Peter said that he forgave 7 times, Jesus' answer was that he forgave 70 times 7, then went on forgiving until the act was universal. In order to forgive hate, he centered his attention on love. This was not only when it touched his life, but when he saw it manifest in the world about him. The truth was the inherent light that he saw in all, which would lead them out of darkness when applied with understanding. He knew that every overcomer was covenanted with his Lord to be continually forgiving sin, in meeting every inharmony with truth, and this was his way of being about his Father's business. He saw and understood that in no other way could the earth be transformed and peace and harmony prevail among men, and he said, "If you forgive me their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you." In order to appreciate the full value of this statement, you may ask, what is the Father? The Father is life, love, power, and dominion, and all of these attributes belong to the child by rightful inheritance. This is what Paul meant when he said we are joint heirs with Christ to the God kingdom. This does not mean that one has more than another. This does not mean that the eldest son gets the larger portion and the other half is divided by measure to the remaining children. To be a joint heir with Christ to the kingdom means to be an equal participant in all the blessings of the God kingdom. Sometimes others accuse us of making ourselves equal with Jesus. That is because they do not understand what is meant by joint heirship. I am quite certain there is not one among us that would say he was on the same plane of enlightenment as the great master. With his great white purity, this joint heirship means to have the possibility of the same power, the same strength, the same degree of understanding, and yet there is not one among us that does not realize the full truth of the promise of Jesus to all of God's children, to every true disciple, that they may be full participants in all the qualities of the Godhead as fully as he is. We fully recognize this meaning when he said, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." We know full well that that great soul never for a moment asked for his disciples a mental or moral impossibility. When he saw and asked perfection of man, he knew that he asked only that which man can live up to. A great many have taken false comfort in the belief that they can never be as perfect as the Master is perfect. They argue that he was divine and that because of his divinity, he had marvelous works which no other member of humanity could possibly do, and that, therefore, it is absolutely useless to try. They say they are here with nothing better or more skillful or scientific with which to carve out life's destiny than mere human willpower. The great master made it clear that while it did take some human will power to start, the mere human will is not a great factor in the case. The great factor being divine understanding. How many times did he say, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free"? Let us reduce this to the simple physics of the world about us. The moment man becomes fully acquainted with the truth of anything in the physical world about them, that moment they become free of their ignorant concept of that particular thing. The moment men became acquainted with the fact that the world was round and that it revolved around the sun, they became free from the antiquated idea of the flat earth and rising and setting sun. The moment men become free from the belief that there are mere human beings, subject to human laws of life and death and the limitations which human beings have imposed, that moment they see that they are free from all human limitations and may become sons of God if they will. The moment they realize they are divine, they are free from all limitations and possessed of the strength of divinity. And man knows that this divinity is the place where being comes most directly in contact with God. Man is beginning to see and know that this divinity is not something to be injected into each from without. He is beginning to know that it is the very life of each and every man. We know that the ideals we see in the lives of others take root in our lives, and, in compliance with the divine law, bring forth after their kind. As long as we believe in the power of sin and see the effect of sin as a reality, the punishment of that sin will be vital in our own lives. But as we give to ourselves and others truly righteous thoughts, for all inharmonious ones, we are making ready the harvest of a great spiritual feast which is certain to follow the seed time. Thus, forgiveness has a twofold mission. It frees both the erring and the loving one. From back of the application of forgiveness is a deep and radiant love, a love founded on principle, a love that desires to give for the joy of giving with no thought of reward save that of the Father's approval in the words, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." These words are just as true for us as they are true for Jesus. Your sins, sickness, or discord are no more a part of God or your true self than fungi are a part of the plants to which they attach themselves. They are the false excrescence which have gathered upon your bodies as the result of wrong thinking. The thought of the disease and the disease are merely the cause and the effect. Erase, forgive the cause, and the effect disappears. Erase the false belief, and sickness vanishes. This was the only method of cure that Jesus ever resorted to. He erased the false image in the consciousness of the one to whom he ministered. He first raised the vibration of his body by connecting his own thoughts with those of divine mind and holding his own thoughts steadfastly in accord with those of the perfection of the divine mind for man. Then the vibration of his body became equal to the vibrations of divine mind. Having thus raised the vibrations of his own body by his steadfast thought of the divine perfection, he was able to raise the vibrations of the body of the applicant with the withered arm to the point where he could erase the image of the withered arm from his own consciousness. Then Jesus could say to him, "Stretch forth your hand." He stretched it forth and became whole. Thus Jesus raised the vibration of his own body by seeing the divine perfection for all, and has enabled him to raise the vibrations of the one he healed until the image of the imperfection was entirely erased. Then the perfection was instantaneous, and the forgiveness was complete. You will soon find that by fixing your thoughts and attention steadfastly on God and His divine perfections, you can raise the vibration of your body so that they will blend so harmoniously with those of the divine perfection that you are absolutely one with the divine perfection and thus one with God. You are then able to influence the vibrations of the bodies of others with whom you come in contact, and they see perfection that you see. Thus you may fulfill the divine mission, and your part is complete. All you may see imperfection, and thus lower the vibrations until imperfection is the result. But if you do this, you cannot escape reaping the harvest of the seed you have sown. God works through all to carry out His perfect plan, and the perfect loving thoughts continually going forth from the hearts of all are God's own message to His children. It is these thoughts that keep the vibrations of our bodies in direct touch with the divine and the perfect vibrations, and this seed is the Word of God that finds lodgment in every receptive heart, whether man be consciously aware of his divine nature or not. We are approaching more fully to our divine inheritance when we can keep our thoughts so fully upon our divine perfection and the divine perfection of all, as held in the mind of God, that the vibration of our body are in direct harmonious accord and one with the divine vibration sent out from the mind of God. But in order to bring forth the abundant harvest of spiritual understanding, our thoughts must continuously vibrate with and lay hold of the perfect harmonious thoughts from the divine mind, or mind of God, to man, His beloved Son. We soon find we have the power to enslave or to free ourselves, as well as to forgive every sin of the whole human family through our attitude of thought, word, or deed, and through the vibration thus released to the whole world. Once having chosen to shape our thoughts along definite lines, we soon find that we are sustained by omnipotence itself, and find as we go through the discipline necessary to assure ourselves of mastery, that it is glorious privilege, this power which we have to free ourselves and our fellow men from bondage through the process of divine thinking. All of Jesus' healings were on the basis of removing the mental cause. So we find that it is necessary to reduce the idealism of Jesus to practical demonstrations, and by doing so we find we are only doing that which he enjoined us to do. Many sins vanish as the first few rays of light shed into dark concept, while others more firmly rooted in consciousness require patience and perseverance to overcome. The forgiving love of Christ must prevail, and we do not obstruct but give it full sway. True forgiveness purifies and blesses all, and begins in the heart of the individual. This is, at first, a thought of reformation, and thus a resurrection. Realizing that God is the only mind, and this mind is pure and holy, will do much to keep one holding steadfastly and worshipping the truth that the mind of Christ is having its perfect way in you, and establishes you in these harmonious constructive thought currents. You become aware that you are always in the ever-flowing stream of the loving thoughts which God is pouring out to his children. You will soon know that you are fast approaching a period in which you will be living in a world of thinkers. You will know that thought is the most potent agency in the universe. You will soon recognize that thought is the mediator between divine mind and every bodily ailment or discord in the world. If you practice looking immediately to the divine mind, a kingdom within, when discord or inharmony arise, you are immediately united with divine ideas, and you will find that the divine love is already to give its healing balm of pure love to those who seek. Jesus lives today to wipe out of human consciousness the power and reality of sin and its effects. Fresh from the heart of love, he came understanding the relationship between God and man, and his fearless, free recognition of spirit as the only power, he proclaimed the supremacy of divine law, which when understood and applied to every act of living, will transform suffering men into radiant beings and usher in the only real kingdom of perfect citizenship, the kingdom of heaven upon earth. Here just cease talking. Chapter 12. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, and the beautiful afterglow, which foretold a peaceful night, was flaming across the entire expanse of sky. It was the first evening free from wind or storm that we had experienced in 10 days, and all were quietly drinking in the magnificent display of color. A quiet sunset of the Gobi can enrapture one into a reverie of forgetfulness of all things. The colors do not glow and shine, they seem to start here and there in great beams, as though the invisible hands were operating colored searchlights. At times it seemed as if these invisible hands were attempting to show the full range of spectrum and the many variations of color to be obtained in the combinations. A wide band of white light would appear, then branding off as at an oblique angle would appear a wide band of violet. From this violet a band of indigo would shoot out, and along the side of the indigo a band of blue would reappear, and so on until the whole atmosphere would appear, and so on until the whole atmosphere seems charged with wide bands of color. And they would combine the blend again to band of white, which seemed quite stationary. Again, they slashed out in fans formation, with beams of every color shooting in all directions. This gradually subsided into a solid golden color, which caused the undulating sands to appear like a sea of heaving molten gold. This display continued for about 10 minutes. Then it faded into a haze of mottled blue, yellow, green, and gray, which seemed to drop from the heavens like a robe of night, and darkness was upon us. So quickly did the darkness surround us that the number of the party expressed startled surprise at its suddenness. The leader of the expedition turned to Baguette Ireland and asked if he would give us his version of the people who had inhabited the region and established the cities like the one that lay in ruins below us. He began by saying, "We have written records that have been carefully kept from generation to generation from over 70,000 years, and these records place the date of the founding of the city, the ruins of which lie below this camp, more than 230,000 years in the past. The first settlers came from the west as the colonists many years prior to the founding of the city. These colonists settled in the south and southwest, and as the colonies gradually developed, some of the people moved north and west until they inhabited the whole land, as the fertile fields and orchards were established. The colonists laid the foundations for cities. At first these were not large, but as years went by, it was found convenient to gather in these centers for a closer fellowship in art and science. Here temples were built, not as places of worship, for the people worshipped every moment by the life they lived, living as always dedicated to the great cause of life. And while they lived cooperating with the great cause, life never failed them. During this time, it was quite common to find men and women thousands of years old. In fact, they did not know death. They passed from one accomplishment to a higher attainment of life and its reality. They accepted life's true source, and it released its boundless treasures to them in an unending stream of abundance. But I have digressed. Let us go back to the temples. These were places where written records of any attainment in knowledge of the arts, science, and history could be preserved for those who wished to avail themselves of them. These temples were not used as places of worship, but as places where the most profound scientific themes were discussed. The acts and the thoughts of worship in those days were carried out in the everyday life of the individual instead of being set aside for a particular group of people or at specified times. They found it more convenient to have a broad, smooth thoroughfares as means of communication, so they developed what you call paving. They found it convenient to build comfortable homes and therefore developed the method of hewing stone and of making brick and mortar necessary to hold them in place, to fashion their homes and the temples. These things you have already discovered. They found that gold was a most serviceable metal, as it did not tarnish. They found means of collecting it from the sands, then from the rocks, and at last a way to manufacture it, so that it became very common. The people found a way to produce other metals as they were needed, and these became plentiful. Then, instead of these communities living by agriculture alone, they began to supply those that tilled the soil with manufactured articles as conveniences for the wider range of operations. The centers grew and developed until they became cities of 200,000 people. Still, they had no temporal heads or rulers. All governing was entrusted to advisory bodies that they were selected by the people themselves. Delegations were sent to and received from other communities. Yet the people promulgated no laws or rules or the conduct of the individual, as each person realized his own identity and lived by the universal law governing that identity. There was no need for man-made laws. There was need only for wise counsel. Then an individual here and an individual there began to wander away. At first, they were the more dominating souls, and they would push on, while those that were inclined to plod would hold back. And unconsciously there came a separation. As the love faculty had not been fully developed by all, the separation grew wider and wider until a very dominating personality let himself up as king and temporal ruler. Since he ruled wisely, the people, with the exception of a few who felt that they could see the future of this separation, acceded to his rule without taking a thought to the future. These few withdrew into communities of their own, and from that time on they lived a more or less secluded life, always attempting to show their fellows the folly of separation. They became the first order of priesthood. The king established the first order of temporal rulers, and from then on their devious ways may only be followed by deep study and research. There are a few that have preserved the simple teachings and have lived to follow them, but in the main, life has become very complex to the majority. In fact, so complex has it become that they refuse to believe that life is simple from the living of a well-balanced life, cooperating directly with the principle of all life. They fail to see that their way of living is the complex and hard way, and that the simple life cooperating with the principle of all life is the more abundant life. In this way they must go on until they know a better way. Here the speaker paused, standing silent for a moment, and the picture flashed before our vision. The picture was stationary at first, as has already been described. Then it became animated. The forms began to move, and the scenes changed momentarily, or at his direction, as he explained each scene. He seemed to be able to hold or reproduce the scene at will, as questions were asked and answer and explanations given. The scenes were those which were supposed to have been enacted in the ruined city below where we were camped. They did not contrast to any marked degree with scenes of populous Oriental city of today, save that the streets were broad and were well kept. The people were well clothed in raiment of good quality, their faces were bright and cheery, and there were no soldiers, paupers, or beggars in evidence. The architecture attracted our attention, as the buildings were well and substantially built and of very pleasing appearance, although there seemed to be no attempt at display. One temple stood out magnificently beautiful. We were told this temple was built entirely by volunteer hands and was one of the oldest and most beautiful in the land. On the whole, if these pictures were representative, the people must have been contented and happy. We were told that soldiers did not make their appearance until after the second king of the first dynasty had reigned for nearly 200 years. That king, in order to keep up his retinue, began taxing the people, and soldiers were appointed to collect the taxes. In about 50 years, property began to show in isolated places. It seemed that about this time, a portion of the people who were dissatisfied with the kingdom and with those who had assumed the rule withdrew. Baghat Irand and his people claimed the lineal heritage of this race. As the night was well advanced, Baghat suggested that we adjourn and retire, since it would be much pleasanter to make an early morning start. About 3 hours of full noonday heat was uncomfortable for travel, and the time of winter storms was fast approaching.